Hello, I'm Paul Catula, and on behalf of MSDE and our scoring vendors, I'd like to welcome you to MCAP Rangefinding. In this opening session, I'll give you a general overview of what we'll be working on over the next few days, followed by a closer look at what rangefinding is all about. One quick note, this general session won't cover the specific constructed response items you'll be working with. Your breakout facilitators from our scoring vendors will guide you through that in your small groups. By the end of this activity, we hope you'll have a clearer understanding of how rangefinding works. Some of you might even walk away inspired to try a mini rangefinding session in your own school to see how students are responding to a particular lesson. It can be eye-opening to take the names off the papers and just look at the responses for what they show about learning. We also hope you'll walk away with a stronger appreciation for holistic scoring, how it works, and why we use it in Maryland to measure students' progress against the learning standards. Holistic scoring is different from analytic scoring. Instead of awarding points for each specific element, holistic scoring looks at the response as a whole. We assign a score based on our overall impression of how well the student understands the standard being assessed. And finally, we want you to come away with a deeper understanding of the rangefinding process itself, how it involves discussing the details of each student's response with your colleagues and reaching consensus scores. Those conversations are often the most valuable part of this activity. They'll give you a better sense of how the standards are being interpreted and taught in different schools across the state. This week, you'll be working most closely with facilitators from our scoring vendor. They'll guide your discussions, walk you through the scoring process, and help your group reach consensus scores. They'll also be taking careful notes that will become the foundation for training the professional scorers. So it's really important that they understand the why behind the scores you assign. That way, your insights get passed along clearly and consistently to the people scoring thousands of student responses. But the real heart of this process is you, the educators. You're the ones making the decisions, offering the rationales, and setting the scoring guidelines for each item. The choices you make this week stay with these items for as long as they're in use. That makes you the most important voice in the room. Let me give you a quick overview of where rangefinding fits into the broader test development cycle. Everything starts with Maryland educators, people like you, writing test questions, including the constructed response items you'll be working with. After that, the items go through a content review with other Maryland educators in our content review committees, or CRCs. These reviewers suggest edits to improve clarity and alignment with our standards. Then the items are field tested with students across the state as part of an MCAP administration. The items you'll be scoring this week are all field test items, and these scores don't contribute to these student scores. That brings us to the key step we're here for, rangefinding, another crucial stage led by Maryland educators. After your committees establish scoring guidelines during rangefinding, the constructed response items are scored on a large scale. Then, the results are reviewed by statisticians, content experts, and other stakeholders to make sure each item performed the way we expected before it's ever used on an operational MCAP test. Now let's talk about your role in all of this. Rangefinding is where we define what each score point looks like for these constructed response items. Our scoring vendor needs to know the qualities that make a response a 1, what pushes it to a 2, and so on, up to the maximum score. And it's Maryland educators who help us set those boundaries. This whole process is about defining the differences. What separates a 1 from a 2 or a 2 from a 3? You'll be digging into how different students express the same idea in different ways. Keep in mind, these are first drafts written under timed conditions. Students don't usually have time to revise or polish. When you're not sure between two score points or unsure exactly what a student means in part of a sentence, always give the student the benefit of your doubt. Because students explain ideas in different ways, two responses that both earn a 1 might look completely different. There's a range at each score point. One response might just barely meet the bar for a 2 by showing something more than minimal. Another might be a strong 2, but still not quite reach the level of a 3. Think of it like letter grades. A student who scores a 91% gets an A, and so does a student who scores a 98%. They're both A-level performances, even though one is stronger. In range finding, your job is to figure out what makes a response a 2, for example, and what sets it apart from responses that stayed a 1. One more thing about the top score point. It's not a perfect paper. In some content areas, we see very few responses earn the top score. Not because students don't understand the content, but because committees sometimes think a 4 has to include everything. That's not true. Just like you can have low 1s and high 1s, you can have low 4s and high 4s. Some responses should be scored on their own merit. You should allow students to take different paths in how they explain their thinking, even if it's not how you would have written it. So, what is range finding? It's the process of setting scoring parameters for each constructed response item. It's where we review enough real student responses to build the materials that will train professional scorers, but it's not the time to revise the item itself. These items are locked. That said, if something doesn't feel quite right about an item, please let your facilitator or MSDE content specialist know. We're always looking to improve, and sometimes we don't spot a problem until we actually see how students respond. Once we're done here, the responses are scored by professional scorers, not by Maryland educators. Your unique perspective as Maryland educators seeing these responses is invaluable. So please do bring up anything that seems amiss with your facilitator or the MSDE content specialist. And just like we can't revise the item, we also shouldn't move the scoring bar. If we shift the boundary between a 1 and a 2, or a 3 and a 4, from one item or grade to the next, we won't be able to track growth accurately. That would mean students might not get credit for what they've truly learned. And we want to make sure every student gets the recognition they deserve. We have several safeguards in place to keep scoring consistent across items, grade levels, and even across years. One of the most important tools is what we call a grounding set. Before you start scoring any new item, your facilitators might walk you through an item that's already been scored. If they do this in your breakout room, they'll show you examples of responses that earned a 1, a 2, and so on. The goal is to make sure that even though the items change, our understanding of important rubric terms stays consistent. Words like minimal, adequate, or phrases like full and complete. In many content areas, we also have a reference sheet that helps clarify what those key words and phrases mean. Your facilitators will go over this with you before you begin scoring. But the bottom line is this: the name of the game in scoring is consistency. And yes, we've bolded that word in the slides at least 3 times. You'll have a few tools to help you during range finding, and this slide just lists them out. One of the main tools is the initial set of 20 to 25 student responses you'll review for each item. These are arranged in order from low to high based on your facilitator's preliminary read. This is a shift from how range finding may have been done in the past. Now, each paper in this initial set has already been pre-scored by your facilitators and reviewed by MSDE to help streamline the discussion. When you go through this first set, you'll see the proposed score. Your job is to look at each response and decide if you agree or disagree. The scores your group agrees on, your consensus scores, will become the official scores for these papers. So even though you're starting with a proposed score, your decisions as a committee take priority. Once your committee finishes scoring the initial set, you'll move on to a second group of about 50 responses. These will be arranged randomly, not by score level. For each response in this second set, your group will work toward a consensus score and provide a rationale. It's really helpful to compare each new paper to ones from the initial set where you've already nailed down official scores. For example, you might say, this feels like paper 8, or this is stronger than paper 10. That kind of comparison gives your facilitators valuable insight as they build training materials for the scorers. Let's talk for a minute about what it means to reach a consensus. A consensus score is one your group agrees on after a discussion. Sometimes you'll all assign the same score on your first read, and sometimes you'll start out in very different places. Either way, the conversation helps shape your shared understanding of the score point. That doesn't mean you have to agree on every little thing, but it does mean you accept the final score and can support it as the one your group is moving forward with. You may have seen the response a little differently, but you're on board with the final decision. And as you work toward that decision, remember, always give the student the benefit of the doubt. That mindset helps ensure fairness and keeps our scoring focused on recognizing what the student did show, even if it's not totally perfect. Now, since you're all educators, you're probably used to grading. But scoring, especially in large-scale assessments, is a bit different. It's done on a much bigger scale across the entire state, and it's based strictly on the standards, not on what was taught in a particular classroom. In your own classrooms, you know your students, and you might grade based on percent correct or growth over time. Here, we're working only with what's written in the response, and we don't get to ask follow-up questions. So when it comes to holistic scoring, we want you to take off your teacher hat and put on your scorer hat. It's not about your expectations for how your students would answer. It's about looking at what a student actually wrote and judging how well it shows understanding of the standard. That includes evaluating how effectively the student uses evidence or reasoning to support their ideas. We can't assume what a student meant or guess at what they might have known if only they'd said it differently. And that's the heart of the difference between grading and scoring. Before we move on to the rubric, there's one long-standing Maryland scoring rule that's really important to know. We call it the 0-1 line. It goes like this: you can't lose a 1. Once a student has shown even the most minimal understanding, that point can't be taken away. You might read a response with just one relevant phrase and a whole page of unrelated or confusing content. But if that one phrase shows some understanding, it's a 1, period. That also means a 0 is absolute. In MCAP scoring, a student earns a 0 only when the response is completely incorrect or irrelevant. We also assign a 0 if the response is just too vague to tell what the student is trying to say, but otherwise, if there's any evidence of understanding, even a little, it earns a 1. Now let's take a look at a specific example, a rubric used for 8th grade social studies. Your rubric will be different depending on the subject area you're working with, and your facilitators will walk you through it in detail once you break out into committees. But there are a few things that all MCAP holistic rubrics have in common, and they're worth noticing. First, they're holistic. That means you're scoring the entire response, not picking apart individual parts and assigning or deducting points line by line. You're forming a judgment based on the full response as a whole. Second, all the rubrics show a progression in how understanding is described from one score point to the next. For example, in this social studies rubric, a score of 3 reflects a significant understanding, while a 4 reflects a substantial one. Your job is to help define what it takes to move from significant to substantial. And you'll do that by looking at real student responses and having those committee conversations that clarify what those terms mean in practice. You'll also notice a shift in language from things like thoughtful to insightful as the score increases. The rubric doesn't define those words, and that's where your experience comes in. Your teaching background, your subject knowledge, and the grounding set examples will help you make that call. Just make sure you're being consistent. If something counted as thoughtful on one item, it should count the same way on the next. Consistency is key. It's what makes this process fair across different items, different committees, and different years. And the way we get there is by grounding our decisions in the rubric language and working together toward shared definitions. Using the rubric isn't optional, it's essential. Your facilitators are counting on you to explain what's in each student's response that led your group to a particular score. And remember, not all 2s or 3s or 4s will look the same. Some will be at the lower end of the range and some will be stronger. When you're giving your rationale for a score, ask yourself some key questions. What does this response include that puts it into this score point? And what's missing or unclear that keeps it from moving up to the next one? Also, try to compare it to responses you've already scored. Is this more like paper 6 or paper 11? That kind of thinking helps you explain the score clearly and gives your facilitator strong material for scorer training. This slide gives you a quick recap of key scoring principles. The first one's simple but essential. You can only score what the student actually wrote. You don't know who the student is or what they were taught. You only have what's on the page. That's what your score has to be based on. Next, let the good parts push the score up. Holistic scoring is an additive process, not a subtractive one. We're not looking for what the student missed, we're looking for what's there. If they make a strong connection to the content, that's what lifts the score. You're not deducting points like a figure skating judge. You're reading for what the student understood and expressed. That said, remember the rubric isn't a checklist. Just because a response doesn't hit every bullet point under a 2 or a 3 doesn't mean it's out of that range. 2 responses might both earn a 2, but they might look very different. Keep an open mind and recognize that students may approach the task in different ways, and that's okay. Give credit for what they did right, even if it's not textbook perfect. That's really the foundation of holistic scoring. Be an advocate for the student. Don't act as a gatekeeper for the top score point. Look for what they're trying to say and how it connects to the standard. Keep in mind, these are first drafts written quickly under testing conditions. And always remember, the most important person in this whole process isn't in the room with you. It's the student who wrote the response in front of you. That's who this is about. Before we dive into the work, let's quickly go over a few housekeeping reminders. First, you may be eligible for CPD credit for participating in range finding. The MSDE content specialist will email those forms to you after the activity. Once you've filled them out, you should submit them to your district central office, not back to MSDE. You may also notice a few visitors popping in and out during the sessions. Folks from MSDE and our scoring vendor partners may stop by your breakout rooms from time to time. They'll introduce themselves, and in most cases, they're just observing to understand how your group is thinking through these responses and scoring decisions. Their role is to make sure the work you're doing lines up with past range finding practices. Both MSDE and our vendors have a history of how these items have been scored, and it's our job to ensure consistency over time. Finally, test and item security is paramount. We take this very seriously. As with any meeting, especially virtual ones, please keep your cell phones on vibrate or silent. Under no circumstances should you share the content of the test items or the student responses outside your breakout room. That includes screenshots, recordings, or any other form of documentation. These materials are secure and must stay secure. Please remember, unauthorized sharing of test items or student responses can have serious consequences, including the potential loss of your teaching license. We take this very seriously, and we know you do too. Everything you'll see this week, the items, the student responses, and the conversations about them, is considered secure material. You've been entrusted with this content, and it's your responsibility to protect that trust by keeping all of it confidential. So please don't share details of your discussions outside your breakout room. Don't post scores in the meeting chat. And for virtual meetings, please keep your camera on during group discussions. It helps everyone stay connected and engaged. While we can't emphasize security enough, we also want to highlight just how valuable this experience is as professional development. This is a chance to really dig into how students across Maryland are responding to these questions. And just as important, to hear each other's perspectives. We've brought in educators from all across the state with different backgrounds and experiences because that range of insight makes this process stronger. So be sure to share your thoughts and, just as importantly, actively listen to your colleagues. After range finding wraps up, you can talk about the process with others. It's fine to share general info about how range finding works, how score training materials are developed, and how you reached consensus on scores and rationales. You can also talk about the general structure of MCAP constructed response items or common patterns you saw in student writing, again, without citing specific examples. But, and this is crucial, you can't share specific details. Don't discuss the actual test items or the exact content of student responses. Your non-disclosure agreement makes that very clear. General insights are fine. Specifics are off limits. Thank you again for being part of this range finding activity. Your expertise and your thoughtful work are essential in helping us build a fair, consistent, and meaningful scoring process for the MCAP. We're excited to have you be a part of it.